Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to March's episode of Don't Get Rusty here at AOPA. This month's topic is a symphony of skills, creative ways to use a simulator to level up your flying. So really glad you guys all joined us. And well, let's get started with the normal stuff like we always do. Before we introduce our special guest, I'm trying to click, there it goes. So on your screen, if you are using a computer, we want to make sure you understand the controls so that you can ask questions and engage with us and our guest. If you're using the PC, check the one on the top there. It says the attendee control panel. On the computer, it will look something like this one here on the right. You want to look for that little bubble that's got the question mark in it. Then type your question in here where it says ask the staff a question and make sure you hit that send button. Otherwise, we won't see it. And then if you're on a tablet of some sort, then you want to use, it should have something like this question mark right here. You tap on that, opens the question box, type in your question, and again, make sure you hit that send button. So that all said, as always, I am Chris Moser here with you from AOPA. I'm the Senior Director of Flight Training Education. And yes, I am a CFI and I work with CFIs and flight schools here at AOPA. I'm glad to be with you. And as always with me, I'm joined by Dan Justman. Say hello, Dan.
Hello, Dan. Ooh, I took one from Steven's playbook. I love it. Good afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon, morning, or evening from wherever you're calling in from. Happy to be here today. Dan Justman, Vice President of the You Can Fly Group in the AOPA Foundation. I get to work with the High School Initiative, the Flight Training Initiative, Flying Clubs Initiative, and Rusty Pilots Initiative. Instrument-rated private pilot, not quite the same flight experience as Chris and our special guest, but certainly the same level and love and passion for aviation. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Steven. Say hello, Steven.
Hello, Steven.
There it is.
Or wait, I was supposed to say hello, Dan.
No, wait, no, you got it right. Nailed it.
So Steven Schroeder, coordinator at the Flight Training Initiative. I work directly with Chris Moser on a variety of projects throughout the year. It's a blast, and I get to also be the producer on this lovely program. And then also joining us today is our very special guest, Josh Harnagel. Josh.
Hi there. Hello, Josh. So just continue. Hi, I'm Josh Harnagel. I'm the VP of Customer Experience at Redbird. Basically, do marketing, sales, services. Anytime you see something or talk to somebody from Redbird, I'm the guy behind the scenes, I guess. But more importantly, CFI, IIMEI, a bunch of experience in GA. I currently own a Bonanza, and I included this picture because Chris and Dan wanted something fun. This was not fun, but it, it's in the past, so it's good. I was on my way to Sun and Fun last March and had all 9 quarts of oil go out the tailpipe of my Bonanza and landed in a field outside of Mississippi. Airplane was fine, or in Mississippi. Airplane was fine. Passengers are fine. Got a new engine, and I'm happy to report that I have about 100 hours on that new engine. And
all right, good.
Plane is flying well.
And all the oil.
And yeah, I'm working real hard to keep all the oil inside of the engine this time.
Whew. All right, so that obviously is impressive. I remember you telling us that story too when that happened. So that is crazy. But look, you can see what a beautiful landing you must have done there, except for that just a little bit in the dirt.
Yeah. So funny story. That was my co-pilot passenger jumped on the brakes as we were coming up to those trees and skidded the tires. And so I have now disabled the co-pilot brakes.
Like a switch to turn it on and off or something. So, all right. Well, thank you, Josh. We're really happy to have you here, and we'll throw it back to Dan because I know we wanted to make a mention about the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. So just wanted to remind everyone or bring you up to speed on this, that Don't Get Rusty and all the other You Can Fly programs that we do are not funded by AOPA member dues. We are part of the AOPA Foundation, being the philanthropic arm of our organization, and everything that we do is funded by generous donors. So if you would like to support, we hope you do, like to see more Don't Get Rusty episodes and things like this, please go to aopafoundation.org and share what you can.
Cool. And then Dan, there's always the special slide we've got to do.
We've already got questions coming through. Wings credit, yes. For those watching live, yes, we've got wings credit for you. All you needed to do is register with your FAAsafety.gov email address, and if you've done that, there's nothing more that you need to do. We'll take care of that. Stephen will take roll call on our platform here and send that into the FAA, and in a couple days you'll see that credit showing up there. If you do not or did not register, or don't know if you registered with your FAAsafety.gov, please email ftinitiative@aopa.org. Did I say that right? ftinitiative at
That's correct. You got it.
aopa.org. Please send an email there. Don't put it in the chat. We get those pieces lost there. So ftinitiative@aopa.org to verify or to give us your FAAsafety.gov email address. The other question I already see popping up is, hey, there's something in here that I'm really expected to like or want to go back and see it again. You guys are so smart, and Josh, you're amazing. But I want to get that moment in time back. How can I see that? So we do record these webinars. It's on YouTube, and it's also on AOPA.org. The webinars.aopa.org. We've got playlists on both. For YouTube, it's AOPA Pilot Video, and then just our webinars page. So you will not get wings credit if you're watching the recorded version, but certainly all the great information that Chris and Josh will share today can be viewed again on those platforms. That's it for me.
All right, thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
And then Stephen, you want to tell us a little bit about this day in aviation history?
Yes, March 21st, 1933, James L. Kinney makes the first cross-country test of blind flying. So as they were developing and perfecting IFR and instrumentation. So he took it for a test run from College Park to New Jersey.
I do that flying all the time because I get scared. I don't know about you, Josh, but and then this one as well.
I thought this was neat because it popped up when I was looking for stuff. But bonus fact, tomorrow, the term naval aviator is adapted by the United States Navy, replacing the word Navy air pilot, and they still use that phrase today.
I think it's a better term too.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I know that the big thing that we're doing today, we were really, really happy to have Josh with us from Redbird, because he is an expert in sims, as you can imagine, working there at Redbird. And he's put together an awesome presentation for us today, just talking about why we want to use a sim and what it's all about, what we can do with it. And it's really not just about IFR. It's also about doing it with even VFR practice. So we're going to talk a whole bunch about that. So what I'm going to do, and Josh, I don't know if you want to say anything about this, but in the meantime, I'm going to give the presentation over to you. So I'm about to switch that. And there it goes. So we'll just give Josh a moment to get his screen up. There we go.
All right, can you all see that?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, perfect. So, well, Chris and Dan and Stephen made a terrible mistake by inviting me, because now I get to talk about whatever I want to talk about, and they can't stop me. But we will talk about some sims eventually. But I have this kind of start with a little bit of my soapbox about proficiency. And so really, we kind of start with the idea that using a sim for proficiency, a lot of people have questions about it, but at the end of the day, it's pretty simple. Buy a sim, hopefully a Redbird, use it every week, and then you're done. And that'll make you proficient. So I appreciate everybody's time. Thanks.
Hey.
And yeah, I think.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, that was the shortest wings credit approved seminar ever. No.
Yeah, is it time for questions now, or?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, really. Why would you want to use a simulator if you're a pilot, right? If you are not just a sim enthusiast, but you actually, fly airplanes and really that's what you prefer to do, why would you use a sim? So it really, at the core, end of the day, what's the most common cause of fatal general aviation accidents? Well, thankfully we have government agencies that report on this stuff. This data was from 2018, and it's 5 years worth of data. It looks basically the same no matter what 5 years you look at it. And we have top 10. Everyone's probably familiar with this list if you've been in the aviation world. But really, if you break it down, those things that are highlighted are directly pilot related. Loss control, fuel related, and just if you're not familiar, fuel related, 99.9% of the time that means they ran out of gas. And then low altitude operations, mid-air collisions, a lot of that stuff can be directly tied back to a pilot. In fact, 80%, 8 out of 10 fatal accidents, the pilot is probably, it may not get categorized, but the pilot is, the NTSB probable cause will say, pilot failed to X, right? So the number one cause of fatal accidents in GA is pilots, and that's the number one way to prevent accidents is to be a proficient pilot. The airlines have proved this. They have a whole system of stuff, not just the pilot training side, but safety management systems around maintenance and currency and all that. But at the end of the day, they train every 6 months in a very specific, very regimented way, and it has greatly improved their safety results. And so proficiency, just to put it out there, it's high degree of competency or skill. I personally like professionalism. That's one of the synonyms. You should know what that means, and you should know when you feel proficient. But why is it hard for GA pilots to get and stay proficient? It's a goal. Most pilots don't have a stated proficiency goal. You know, if you talk to somebody, you say, "What's your goal for pilot proficiency?" It'll be, "Well, I don't know, feel comfortable." Achieving a goal requires a plan, and most GA pilots don't have a defined proficiency plan. Now, I'm sure everybody in this webinar has one, but if you are familiar with the industry, you'll know that most folks are just sort of go out and, oh, let's go do some touch and goes today. And then
hey, Josh, if we could just hold on 1 second too. I know Dan's got a question there, it looks like.
Yep,
Sorry.
and it was just, we've got a couple of notes coming through from the viewers that the slides are really small on what we're seeing. Wondering if there's a way we could enlarge that so they could see it a little better.
Why don't one of y'all take the slides, and you're just gonna have to follow along.
Be the clicker. Chris, you're the clicker.
I will do that. Let me do that just 1 second. And the other thing I was just going to mention too is we do have handouts. So for some of the stuff that Josh has already spoken about, for example, part of the plan, we have the AOPA focus flight review, and I'm trying to talk as I do this, which is a challenge. But let me just pick up. So I think we were right about here. Be a proficient pilot. Yes. Okay. I think I got it. And I'm going to switch over to the screen right now. And that's me. Show my screen. All right, hopefully everybody's seeing that.
Okay, sorry.
Much better.
Okay, cool. All right, let me click up here. Go ahead.
Yep, so let's go down to practices, time consuming, expensive, and often focused on the wrong things. So, you know, flying airplanes is pricey. And next slide. And so, yeah, sorry. Flying airplanes is pricey, and so in general, most GA pilots don't practice really. And so, in summary, most general aviation pilots don't practice. Next slide. They don't have a goal. They don't have a plan, and they don't practice for that to reach that plan. So, therefore, pilots are the #1 cause of accidents in GA. So I just real quick, I'm gonna go super fast here. What is the personal proficiency plan? The FAA actually defines it for us in AC 68 or 6198D in the very front. They define it as a criteria, and, you know, and they suggest that pilots develop their own currency program. They don't really give a whole lot of additional support on that, but it's there. It's not regulatory, but they certainly suggest it, and they say you should do it beyond whatever is required by currency. And now, Chris, if you can jump us to the next slide, and then I'm gonna skip through these, the individual slides. So we'll go from here to 47. So the components of a plan. Now, I have a whole webinar that I've done, a presentation on this in the past, but essentially, when you think about a plan, I like to think about it from sort of a business plan perspective. And I do this personally. So I have a mission, I have objectives, policies, procedures, budgets all around my flying. And there are things like I'm going to schedule a flight. I'm going to fly in the sim at least once every 2 weeks. I'm going to fly with a flight instructor once every quarter, and just go through and really define out the things that I want to do to stay proficient and to meet my my mission and my objectives. So if we hop on down, and you can just kind of go through all these, and then, set up policies that are, personal minimums, all that kind of stuff. Again, this is not the point of the presentation, but this next slide is the point of this whole intro. Why did we do that? So let's talk about, simulators. Simulators make this possible. I really cannot think of a way that a GA pilot would do this really effectively and hit all the things they need to hit in their proficiency training without having access to some kind of simulator. Just from a cost perspective, but also from there's stuff you don't want to do in the airplane that you really ought to practice. And then at time, even if you own an airplane, there's still a bunch of overhead and time to get out to the airport, to pull it out of the hangar, to get it to the practice area, all that kind of stuff. The sim eliminates that. Any sim eliminates that. So when we talk about a simulator, what is a simulator? There's a range, and obviously I'm biased. I sell simulators for a living. My paycheck relies on people buying our products, but I'm also realistic and a pilot, and I use pretty much the whole range of these. So if you go to the next slide, on the kind of what we call low end, you have the iPad. On the high end of the things we're going to talk about, you have what's called an AATD, and we'll talk about a BATD and an AATD and what those mean. Those are specific designations, but all of this can play a role in somebody's proficiency training, and it's not, obviously it sort of, from iPad through ATD, you get increasing functionality and realism and all that kind of stuff, but you can still use the iPad for a lot of things. I personally use Infinite Flight. I think they do a good job, and it's a realistic aircraft simulation, and you can
use that too.
You can, practice cross countries, and you can do it from the comfort of your couch. And it's very, very straightforward. But so we have an iPad, you have your kind of traditional desktop at-home flight simulator where you have a computer, some controls plugged into it, Microsoft Flight Sim or X-Plane or something like that running on it. And I do want to take a quick note here on those desktops. If you're going to use it for training at all, I think it's super important to have realistic controls. You want to have a yoke, a throttle, and some rudder pedals. The throttle's a little less important, but it's not one of my products, but I'll put it out there. The honeycomb yoke is pretty good, and it's pretty low cost. And I think it'll accomplish everything you need to sort of do the basics. Obviously, Redbird sells some stuff that's higher end, but and more specific to GA airplanes. But I think if you're going to do it, make sure you get rudder pedals and that kind of thing, because it does basically become a version of the iPad if you're just using the keyboard to fly around with. So if you're going to invest in a computer in that, you might as well get some controls as well.
Right.
From there,
question.
Yep, quick question. So looking at this slide, Josh, we had a question come in from Ryan. Where does VR fall in this range or fit into a proficiency program?
Okay, so VR is super interesting technology, obviously. I'll say from our perspective, from Redbird's perspective as a manufacturer of approved simulators, we think MR, mixed reality, is probably a little bit more valuable for loggable training. But at home, VR I think is really useful if you plug it into a desktop PC and you're kind of cognizant of its limitations and its value. So if you're doing anything related to the ground, so any kind of ground reference maneuvers or pattern work or anything like that, or even shooting approaches down to minimums and dealing with what it looks like when you pop out, a circling approach, VR can be really beneficial for that. If you're just flying around doing air work, it's probably the distraction because it has, if you ever spent any kind of significant time with a headset on, it is there's eye strain. Some people get kind of queasy with them. It's this thing sitting on your head, and depending on which unit you have, they weigh, sometimes a distracting amount. So even if it's VFR, but you're just going out to do steep turns or something like that, where really what you need is the straight ahead view, it's probably not worth plugging in. But if you're doing pattern work or anything related to the ground where you need to look around, super valuable in that environment.
How about helicopters, Josh? Any desktop simulators for helicopters?
Oh, man, helicopters are a tough world on the simulator side. Really, all the sim development on the helicopters is really focused on the higher end, like higher end approved devices and higher end helicopters themselves. I think there are some helicopter simulation software, but that could run on a desktop, but I'm not super familiar with it. And there is that I'm aware of, there is not a mass market kind of plastic control system for a helicopter. All of the sort of mass market affordable controls are really focused on fixed wing. So unfortunately, the helicopter guys don't really have some great options there. But it's a smaller market. So from a business perspective, sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense.
I do know you guys have a larger one though. I remember seeing that at I don't know if you still have it, but I remember years ago seeing that at AirVenture, right? So
yes, we make an AATD helicopter simulator. It's $160 some odd thousand. So probably not an option for most at-home pilots.
Right, but maybe they can go someplace that's maybe close by to do that. Yeah. All right. Go ahead, Josh.
Okay. So just throw this out there. We're not the only manufacturer of them. There are some other ones that make sort of all-in-one home sims. Ours is called the J, but basically this is essentially a desktop PC, but you don't have to mess with picking software, connecting hardware to it, or trying to use it to run Microsoft Windows or Microsoft Office on. It's only function is to be a simulator. And so for some people that don't want to go down the path of picking controls, that might be an option. And then from there, you get into the approved devices, a BATD and an AATD. So let's go to, and these are mostly found in flight schools. The BATDs, we do have people that put them in their house because there's some advantages there. But the AATDs especially are kind of a flight school sim. So let's go on. So can you log it? If you're an AATD or a BATD, sometimes you can log it for some things, but at the end of the day, and you can go to the next slide. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter all that much, because when you're talking about proficiency training, when you're attempting to not get rusty or don't get rusty, what matters is the training, not the logging, except for approaches, which we'll talk about. And the FAA has been nice to us there. So we can go down to the next slide. Just to make sure we cover it, the sort of big buckets that the simulators fall into for the FAA, and it is different if you're in Europe or whatever, and that may be an offline conversation that we can have. But the airlines, flight safety, CAE, they all use full flight simulators, levels A through D, primarily levels C and D. A level D simulator is equivalent to the airplane in terms of what you can log as far as the FAA is concerned. Down from that are FTDs, which you don't really see that much in flight schools. There are some, but in 2008, the FAA came out with a new level called aviation training devices, which removed a ton of the regulatory burden and was one of the best things they've done for aviation safety, in my opinion. And there are two types of ATDs. So we can go on to the next slide. So aviation training device is the ATD portion of it. There's a basic version and an advanced version. There are just sort of on the manufacturer, there are different criteria for each one as far as what visuals and equipment is provided, what structure tools are provided. But and we can go on to our next slide here. For the pilot, what counts is in a BATD, you can do, which is like the smaller desktop one, you can do 10 hours towards an instrument rating under 61. It's a percentage of a course under part 141. And you can log your instrument currency. 6157C2 is the controlling regulation. And that's the same as the airplane. 6 approaches in 6 months with a hold. You can do 3 approaches in the sim, 3 approaches in the airplane, and the hold in the sim. It's how I ensure my instrument currency. I fly the hold is the hardest thing for me to get in the real airplane. Generally, when I'm flying the airplane, I'm not doing training flights. I'm going somewhere, and you never get holds. And so I do 6 approaches and at least 2 holds in the sim every 2 months. So that's how I do it. On the ATD side, you get a little more time for your instrument rating, but you can do again, you do the instrument currency and the majority of an IPC, which we can talk about at the very end a little bit.
And just real quick, we get 2 questions that apply to this as well. One person was asking, I know it was Gary asking here, ballpark cost of the BATD or AATD, just to have an idea of where that might fall.
Yeah, so a BATD is generally going to be somewhere between, I don't know my competitors' prices really well, but somewhere in the, I'd say probably 7,000 is about as low as you can get for the BATD through 12 or 13,000. Ours are currently at like 8 and 9,000, depending on what you get. Those prices are going to go up. You heard it here first.
Buy now, buy now.
Yeah. And then the ATDs, you can get into an ATD for around 30, maybe 35, and then those go all the way up. You know, we make ATDs for for like a Cessna Mustang or a King Air that'll be 250 or 300,000.
Okay, and then the other one was too, I know that you mentioned the instrument currency here. Did you want to, we have a lot of folks that may not be instrument rated. What about for if they were doing VFR training or like for the private or things like that?
Yeah, so go back to no, you don't really, but sometimes, but it doesn't matter. So for VFR stuff, you really, if you already have you can log a little tiny bit of time for a private pilot's license. It's 2.5 hours right now in an ATD. Or in an AATD, an advanced one. In a BATD, you can't log any time for the private, and you don't get any currency credit for your private pilot's license, your standard certificate. And that's because currency for that is based off of landings, and you cannot get landing credit in an ATD of any kind. Period.
But would you say that maybe you could get proficiency out of it, even for VFR?
Totally could get proficient off of it, right? And to be totally honest, the only sims that'll give you landing credit are level Ds, basically. Some level Cs, depending on the curriculum they're in, but you got to go up to $30 million. So you might as well just buy an airplane and fly that around.
It'd be cheaper, even with the gas and hangers.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Okay. And you can go on to the next slide. Okay. Just as a little background, if you're ever curious about this, the FAA has a AC 61136B, which is for me, the manufacturer. It defines what I have to do to get it approved and reapproved and all that kind of stuff. And then if you own a BATD or if you're in a flight school that has an ATD of any kind, the FAA will send the manufacturer a letter of authorization that's valid for 5 years. That has to be displayed somewhere where the pilots that are logging that time can see it. And in that letter, it'll have a long list of, by regulations, exactly the things that you can do in it and the regs that apply. And it can be different depending on which manufacturer and which ATD, which device type it is. I know for a fact we get a little, Redbird has some devices that get a little extra credit for some things. And then there is what's called a qualification and approval guide, which is what the manufacturer submits to the FAA to get that letter of authorization. And that's got all the details to sort of match up with the AC and why it should be approved and all that. But less paperwork, more fun.
Yes.
Okay, so what should you do with it? This is really the kind of the meat and potatoes. What should you do with the sim?
Let me just throw one more. Somebody asked, and I think this is a good question applying to what we just talked about with logging. How is a hold in lieu of procedure turn logged for currency? Like I think what they're getting at is maybe can you log that for your holding currency? Yeah, and I'd agree. You can check that under, by the way, 6157C. I don't know that off the top of my head. I just happened to look it up while you were talking. But 6157C, and it just says holding procedures, and that's clearly one if you've done a good turnaround. Anyway, go ahead, Josh.
Yeah. Okay. So on the next slide, whenever I think about this, let's start at the very beginning. What is a sim, right? What is it? in the training and proficiency environment, what it is can kind of help you define what you can do with it. So let's, just because it's pretty graphics, go on to the next slide. And a sim is a tool, right? But a sim is not an airplane. So an airplane has, you can go next, the airplane has some really fun things about it, like the fact that it flies, but it also has some really bad things about it, like the fact that you have to taxi it to the runway and take off and go somewhere, and you have a maintenance and a bunch of regulatory requirements every time you fly it. It's important to remember the sim can start anywhere. It can really go anywhere. It doesn't, you don't have to fly it from the airport to the practice area. You don't, in most sims, we don't have to obey the rules of time. We can speed things up, we can slow things down, we can pause. And so really, when you get in the airplane, or when you get in the sim, it can sometimes be tempting to be like, well, I'm gonna fly this exactly like I would fly the airplane. And in terms of procedures, that's probably a good idea. But in terms of the limitations of the physical reality that we operate in, no, let's skip some of the parts that don't matter for the thing we're working on, right? Mm-hmm. If I want to hammer a nail, I get a hammer. I don't, so if I want to work on steep turns, let's go straight out to the practice area or someplace where we can do steep turns safely and do those right away instead of take off and land and all that jazz. All right. So kind of broad picture stuff, and I like to include these because the next slide is actually the more important one. We don't have to go there yet, but generally a sim is for proficiency in maneuvers, procedures, checklists, avionics, all that kind of stuff are great sim stuff. Anything you have to remember or a flow you have to use, air speeds, power settings, all that stuff, the sim is a really good place to practice that. And what's nice about it is it's really good to practice. You can practice that by yourself. It doesn't take a lot of, you don't need somebody there coaching you if you already know what you're supposed to do and you're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I do this flow? Like, what's the best way to do my pre-landing check flow or that kind of stuff? The sim is really good for that. The other thing, and the thing that I think most pilots probably think of because they think airline training, are the sort of situational awareness, decision-making, emergency training, and obviously the sim is fantastic for that, both VFR, IFR, whatever you're doing. I will say the one difficulty with it is if you're going to do it well in a way that really has real training value and goes beyond just procedures, like running through the checklist for this emergency, you kind of need an instructor or another pilot or somebody to set it up for you, because the value of the sim in that situation is that you get surprised. And I'll say from personal experience, I have been surprised and felt that sort of physical reaction of panic in a simulator, not to the same level, but in a simulator, in a training session that I did in my airplane at 15,000 feet when the oil pressure was at 0. And it was nice. It's kind of, I didn't think it at the time, but it's sort of reassuring that I got to experience at least a fraction of what that feels like in a sim before I got into it in the real world. And I had done all my procedures in the sim, so I knew exactly what I needed to do when I got there to the airplane. So from you can start at sort of rote procedural stuff and move into, okay, applying it in maneuvers and applying it to my avionics. And then hopefully if you got a good instructor around, you can do some of the more advanced stuff. Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, quick question. You're talking about procedures, practicing. Would it make sense to do like instrument departures, takeoffs, things like that in the sim too? Is there a benefit there?
Totally. I think instrument departures are one of those things that do not get practiced enough. And if you're taking off, I mean, under 61 legally, you can go 0-0. And if you're taking off and right after you get off the ground, you're going into the clouds, that's a dangerous transition that should be practiced for sure. And the sim is great for that. Okay, so I'll try to speed up a little bit here. So go on to the don't use a sim for. And I say maybe because I've given a version of this slide to a bunch of different audiences, and I always get people push back and say, well, I use it for that. Generally speaking, all sims are terrible at, well, they don't, even the level Ds don't have great feel, and flaring the airplane is about feel. It's about the, what it feels like in your butt, what it looks like at the front of the cockpit. and the sim's not great at that. And so I personally don't let pre-solo students land the sim. From a primacy of learning perspective, I want them to really isolate what it feels like to be in the flare in the airplane. But getting to that flare, all useful sim stuff. And once you actually know how to land an airplane, go ahead, you can land the sim, that's fine. But you're not going to learn, you're not going to probably improve your flare very much in the sim, but you might improve the pattern and the setup and all of that stuff. And then I'm a big believer in people need to know what the airplane feels like when it's about to stall, and like buff it, and feeling the controls and all that kind of stuff. Sim's not going to do that. And then on the ground, it taxis like a Zamboni. Ours does. Every sim I've been in, it does. It just, it doesn't feel like the rudders work the way they're supposed to. But you can still do runway familiarization. I actually do that in all the time. If we're going someplace big that's got multiple runways and parallel taxiways, and I'm getting taxi instructions for, Charlie 2, it's nice to pull up the plate, figure out, okay, that's what that means, and taxi around on the ground in the sim. I think that can be helpful. Okay, next slide.
Yep.
All right, so what should you do with it? You should practice your mission. And this is really one of those things that I think the sim's particularly good at, because in the airplane, proficiency training usually looks like a primary flight instruction training event, where if you're VFR, you go out, you do stalls and steep turns, maybe some landings, all that kind of jazz. And then if you're instrument, you go and you shoot like 3 approaches in a row, back to back to back. But that's not your mission. That's not what you do in the airplane when you're flying around with a purpose, right? You're going to lunch, or you're flying your family on a vacation, or you're doing it to support your business. And you're, like I have a thing about, we don't teach people how to transition, especially in IFR flight, from cruise, from en route to the approach segment. And so you go from basically falling asleep for 2.5 hours to like in 10 minutes, oh man, I need the weather, I need to brief this approach, and then maybe I'm going to get some weird vectors. And on vectors, when you don't fly full procedures in the real world, but for some reason all we teach is full procedures. Which we should teach that, but in the real world, you're going to get vectors. And a really useful skill is to be able to look at the approach and your vector, and gauge how busy the controller is, and plan for the idea that you're going to get vectored through that final approach course. And that's, you do that in the sim yourself. But practice your mission. So what do you use the airplane for? What's the kind of stuff you want to do? Practice that, and practice the things that can go wrong in that kind of scenario, and the thing that you actually do. Next slide. And then practice what is painful. So this is more like when you think about the different things that happen or could do happen, or that you can do in your airplane. What are the things that give you heartburn? Like, I really don't want to go do that. Well, that's a good clue that maybe you should go do that in the sim. So, power on stalls in my airplane is kind of, it's not fun. It's got a big 300 horsepower engine, and you got a really high deck angle, and it's just not a lot of fun. So I've done them. I do them every year when I do my recurrency flight, but I'm gonna practice that in the sim because it's painful to do in the airplane, and I don't really want to do it. All right, you can go on to the next one.
Okay.
And then practice what is dangerous. So, and by this I mean what's dangerous to do in the airplane. Obviously, shutting the engine down with the mixture knob and flight is dangerous to do in the airplane, so you should do that in the sim. But also things like 0-0 or very low instrument departures are you don't want to do that for the first time in a while in the airplane. If you have a mountain flights, flying through if you're not very familiar with flying in the mountains and you have a trip coming up where you're going to have to go through a pass, well, let's do that in the sim first before you go do it in the airplane. Stuff that is dangerous to do in the airplane that increases the risk beyond what's reasonable. Certainly it would be a good clue that should be moved to the sim. And then practice what kills people. So go back to that, and then we can go on to the next slide. And this was my personal favorite thing when I sit down with pilots that are, have a couple hundred hours, are using an airplane, flying 50 to 100 hours a year, and they're really in the danger zone. There's a book I think called The Danger Zone about this, where I think it's from like 300 to 700 hours of total time. You've gotten through the sort of learning stuff. You feel comfortable. You get in the airplane and you start pushing those boundaries a little bit, and you get into trouble. And I do think people should push their boundaries. I think, you know, one of the things that kills GA is the idea that you know, it's expensive, and then we add all these rules about when you can and can't fly, and so the utility of the airplane goes way down, even though it may be legal to fly. You know, somebody told you, well, you only have 250 hours, so you shouldn't fly in winds over 10 knots. Well, I mean, that sort of limits your options. So maybe get comfortable with flying in winds up to 15 knots, and then the plane will be more valuable to you. So I like to go through these sort of things. I'm a big NTSB accident report reader, sort of morbid, but I think going through the things that get people in trouble, the decisions that get people in trouble, and trying to replicate, see what the pilot saw, and do that kind of stuff in the sim, I think is super important. And things like, you know, the top two, loss of control in flight and control flight into terrain. I mean, how many pilots actually think that they would ever do that? You know, everyone's like, no, I can fly the airplane, but yet some 8,000 hour ATP is flying a Baron that he's owned for 40 years and has 2,000 hours in, and somehow he manages to lose control in flight. So how do you get there? Let's go through that and practice that in the sim and see what that would look like.
Right. By the way, some of our folks are mentioning too, the book's called The Killing Zone.
The Killing Zone. Thank you very much.
There it is. Yep. They're very good. We can always ask the audience if we're in doubt, because they normally will know.
Yes, yeah, it's an excellent book, and it's not the theme song to the Top Gun. So, but you should play that song on repeat every time you're in the sim. Just
of course.
Okay. And then our kind of next thing is, what should you do with it? Practice what gets rusty first. And this is some research that we did based on academic studies. This is not specifically related to aviation, but on a big picture, we have, and we intuitively know this, muscle memory, right? You can get up, if you haven't ridden a bike in 2 years, you can get on a bike and pretty quickly pick it up, versus knowledge decay. So the psychomotor skills, the controlling of the airplane, where your hands go, throttles move, all that kind of stuff, decays, but it decays at a much lower rate than your knowledge. And so circling back to that loss of control in flight, what usually happens is there's a knowledge gap, where they get overwhelmed by procedural stuff, and like, how do I load the GPS in this situation, or in a go around or whatever, and then that fills up their RAM and distracts them from the psychomotor stuff. So if you want to practicing that kind of knowledge-based thing, those knowledge-based skills in the sim is really beneficial for pilots that already know how to fly the airplane, right? It's not that you get in the sim to figure out how to do a landing or how to do a steep turn. It's to practice, what's my power setting? What's the airspeed I'm supposed to be at? When do I start rolling out? All that kind of stuff is really a knowledge thing. It's less of a psychomotor thing.
Somebody's asking, we have two quick questions here. Somebody's asking what the axes are. So I assume it's percent on the vertical.
Oh, yeah. So the left side, or the up and vertical axis, is essentially percentage, right? And they take a baseline test at the beginning on day one of psychomotor skills and knowledge, and then those are days on the lower axis. So they get retested every 10 days, I think, in the study this came from. And so what's interesting is that your knowledge actually, it sticks in your memory for about a week, and then it starts coming down pretty dramatically. Yeah. And so, I mean, you're by day 186 months, you've lost 40% of, you're scoring 40% lower than you did on day one.
Oddly enough, we don't keep thinking about regs all the time. I don't understand why. I mean, yeah. And I know we've got a bunch of questions. We'll probably hit that on the Q&A section. People asking about using things like VATSIM and virtual ATC. So maybe we'll hit some of those when we get to that question. I know lots of folks are asking. That's why I'm mentioning it. Okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to throw out a couple of VFR, or a couple of events. One for VFR, one for IFR, and we'll go, like I said, go quick. But in the VFR world, you know, newer pilots entering the traffic pattern can be difficult, figuring out how they're going to do it. Especially, this is kind of the VFR equivalent of my issue with IFR. You just flew an hour and a half to get somewhere for lunch, and you didn't think about it beforehand, and now you're like, oh man, the wind's changed. How am I going to enter on 45? So start a sim. This is perfectly usable in an iPad sim. You can do this at home on the couch, and your goal is to practice it. So we can go to the next slide. You're going to start in the air. Near the airport, just randomly drop yourself in, get the weather, start pause, get the weather, do all that. If you use ForeFlight, maybe pull out ForeFlight and draw it all on a scratch pad, or visualize it for yourself. Unpause, enter the pattern, do it again, do it again, do it again, and then your goal is to reduce the amount of time that the sim is paused, and so you can do it live. So if you're 5 miles from an airport, you're like, I need to land there. If you've done this enough times, you'll be able to figure out real quick, like, oh, this is how I enter the pattern. Got it, because you've got a lot of practice on it. And this is a knowledge thing, right? This is not a psychomotor skill. So this is the kind of thing that you could repeat this practice, frequently. I mean, I don't fly VFR very much anymore, or ever really, in this kind of situation. And so yeah, I'd probably be pretty rusty at that.
And I think that the key part there too, just to mention as well, is that it's that putting yourself in a random place each time too, because otherwise if you just keep doing the same one over and over, you're like, well, I already know the entry. So yeah, change it up.
Yeah, and you're working on being able to do it in real time. Yeah. And so on the IFR side, this is sort of practice approaches. In this one, I do the same approach, and what I'm really working on here is you can go to the next one. That's
okay.
I'm working on repeating the same approach multiple times with variations, and being able to look at the approach plate and quickly recognize the information I need out of it. And I kind of like using the same approach in this, because what ends up happening after you brief an approach 2 or 3 times is that you gloss over it. So if you fly the same approach into your home airport pretty much every time, you will I'm going to brief the plate. Okay, done, right? But what's your actual altitude? What's your first altitude on the mist? It won't stick in your mind, So anyways, we're going to go in the air, start in the air, unpause, fly it. I like, Chris actually had this idea, so I can't give him credit for it, but the idea of note cards. So if you don't use VATSIM or some ATC, virtual simulated ATC, you can do this where you just write clearance instructions on note cards. And if you get really into it, maybe you have like 2 or 3 different steps, and you just pull them out of a hat. And so you can sort of create some random vectors or clearances or whatever it happens to be. And we're going to go, I like to do vectors to final 4 times, full procedure with a hold 1 time, because then you meet your, by the way, you meet your instrument currency on this flight if you do it in a BATD or an ATD. And then a 1 procedure turn, reposition after landing or missed. We do 4 down to missed, or 4 down to mins, or close to minimums with a landing, 2 with a missed, and random if you're able to do it. So like on our sims, you can create random failures and randomize the weather a little bit. Other sims have options like that too, and then 2 with partial panel. And so clearly ideally one of those missed approaches is with partial panel. You can do it because that's a bad day.
Yes, it is. And by the way, somebody had asked earlier, I believe too, on the could you do a random emergencies in some sims? And yes, a lot of them will do that, where they'll have, you can set a timer with this in this range, you can either set which system will fail, or you could just say fail a random system, and you don't know you just know something bad is going to happen, but you don't know what. And the idea with the cards too, what I would do is break them down into categories. I would do like direction I'm coming from. I do this with holds as well. And so it's like hold wherever southwest, and I just have, you can pull out cards, stack them, and if you drop them, immediate in-flight distraction. So it works really well.
Yeah, and on the in-flight distraction thing, a thing I've started doing when I'm working with somebody, like doing an IPC or recurrent proficiency flight with a rated pilot, is I will bang on the wall of the simulator at some point in the flight. Pre-brief it and say, look, when we're in the sim, unless I end the flight, treat it like an airplane. You're in the sim, you're in the scenario, you fly it. If I hit the end button, okay, we can go back to real world. And so they're flying along, and you bang on the simulator on the wall, and somebody goes, you know, they immediately get distracted. What are you doing? It was a bird strike. Keep flying the airplane. All right. So, okay, how do you make the most out of it? And this will go real quick here, Chris. Okay.
Yep.
So the keys to practicing the simulator: refresh, practice, perform. Next slide. Refresh on the ground. Look at what you're going to do. Think about it for a second before you go do it. Practice it in the simulator and perform it in the airplane. So the general basic rule, and I think I do this at the end, don't ever do anything in an airplane that you haven't previously done in a simulator, including approaches. My personal rule is I try to fly every approach into a new airport in the sim before I go to it in the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Bad attitude is bad training. So if you treat the simulator like a video game, you will get a video game result. So, you know, come in with, this is valuable training. I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to put some actual effort into it. Realism matters. And so that means not just realism of the simulation engine or the avionics or whatever, but realism of, I'm going to look at the weather, the simulated weather, before I get in the airplane or before I get in the simulator. If I have the capability, I'm going to put on headsets. I'm going to buckle a seatbelt. I'm going to do the sort of subtle cues that say this is a real thing and can help your mind suspend reality. And then the next slide, the most important button in any simulator is the pause and unpause button, period. It gives it so much value, but it is abused. People pause when they get behind the airplane, but you don't have that ability in the actual airplane. So as long as you're still processing and learning, keep the sim running. When you get to the point where you're totally overwhelmed, you don't know what's happening, your RAM memory, like your computer locks up and you need to Control Alt Delete, pause, catch back up. But it's a super valuable skill to learn how to go from behind the airplane to where you need to be, and the sim can do that really well. Next slide. Yeah, if you haven't done it in the airplane, in the sim, don't do it in the airplane. And that means recently, right? So not just, oh yeah, I did, you know, slow flight 15 years ago. Well, let's do it in the sim before we do it in the airplane. And then this is my sales pitch bit, so we can go real fast. So Redbird Pro is an app we made, came from my idea of the first couple slides, right? People don't have a goal, they don't have a plan, they don't practice. This will help with that. Next slide. We do training and measurement and feedback and blah, blah, blah. It makes everybody's life better. Buy some. Okay, next slide. And,
by the way, there's a link to this in the if you are curious about it, there's a link in the handout to see this.
Yeah, it's a paid proficiency service. The idea is to generate scenarios and training content and recommendations for you based on your actual performance in quizzes and simulation sessions. Okay, all right, we can go on. All right, the keys to effectively using a simulator. This is also the same list I give to instructors. Have a goal when you get in the sim. Every time. If you don't have a goal, it's very easy for it to go into a video game. And so have a goal. And then I like to use real world or realistic weather, meaning most sims, when you start them, default to 1,000 miles of visibility and totally clear skies, and that just doesn't happen in the real world. So even if you're not doing a training around weather or, you know, proficiency flight around weather, set the visibility at 20 miles and put a, you know, broken layer at 8,000 or whatever. And if you have an instructor with you, encourage them to use weather, set up the weather in ways that are very common in that area. So I have 6 scenarios that are based off of very common weather patterns we see in Central Texas, and 4 of them actually can be evolved to be bad weather. But I don't do that in most flights, right? It's just I set it up so that way when they get in the sim, there's always some weather situation available to them. And it's not like if they get in and they see clouds, they go, oh, I better watch the weather, because it's always Miami Beach down here. And then using headsets and ATC services, I think is really good. And Pilot Edge is the best, in my opinion, for this. They use actual controllers. You get, you know, real experience with the language of aviation. They are limited in their geographic coverage area and service times, but if it's a thing you want to work on, Pilot Edge is really valuable for that. I wouldn't say you have to use it on every flight, right? And if you're active in the system, flying IFR, VFR with flight following, you can do it. You can use it as a refresher, but it doesn't have to be part of every flight. And then another huge thing, and I see this especially with inexperienced instructors, is they get in the sim and they think, oh, this is like the airlines. It's gonna be a bad day. We're gonna fail some stuff and give them weather, and you end up creating these situations where there's no, for a professional pilot, that can be really valuable because they're practicing these, very complex procedures that are buried deep in manuals that they never even look at on a frequent basis. For flying a single engine or twin engine piston airplane, we really only have a small universe of really bad things that can happen, and so we don't need to hit it quite that hard. And what's the training value of every flight in the sim ending in a crash, right? We want to don't create inescapable situations. Give yourself options, or if you're working with a student or with an instructor, make sure they give them options. All right, and knowing when to pause, we talked about that. Let's go on. Okay, so if you're teaching, this is new for me. If you're training with a CFI in a sim, the instructor attitude is probably the major factor to how valuable that training is going to be to you. So you want to come in with the idea that, hey, I want to train in the sim. I really value it. I am paying for your time. I need you to do your absolute best to give me good training in this. Obviously, a lot of CFIs are more interested in flight time than they are in effective training, but we want to encourage our CFIs to provide us the training we need, and remember, at the end of the day, it's your training. You own it.
You're the customer.
The system we've set up here is that even in initial private instrument commercial training, most of the time you have a lot of influence on the training you receive. You just don't know you do. And then coming up with a plan based on your mission. I hate going into a flight school and sitting down with an instructor for an IPC, and they're like, okay, we're going to shoot, these 3 approaches at this airport, do a hold and do some partial panel work. Well, yeah, I know that's what the PTS says we have to do, but can we do it in a way that's maybe provides some value to me other than just meeting requirements? And then remembering that basic instrument flying skills is what kills most pilots. It kills pilots. That they get distracted, they get overwhelmed, and their scan totally breaks down. And John Zimmerman had a great blog on Airfax about this. I think it's in the handout. I would encourage you, if you fly IFR, yeah, good job, Chris. If you fly IFR, I would encourage you to read it and then practice like you play. Okay, man, timing is going to be perfect. Okay, next slide. So I do want to touch on this real quick. Is oftentimes a thing that there's some confusion about. So in this table, we pulled out this. There's a little table of stuff.
This is in the handout too. I put it to the ACS up at the page.
So this is based on the current ACS, and you have the second column over is the things you're required to do for an IPC, and by task and by area of operation. The thing that is difficult for sims is that you have to do under area of operation 6, instrument approach procedures, you have to do a circling approach and a landing from an instrument approach. So most sims are not approved for circling approaches for various reasons that aren't relevant right now. And then landing from an instrument approach, again, we have to land, and landing is not a credit available to sims other than level Ds. So what that means is that you can do all that other stuff in a sim and then go out, take off, have your instructor give you vectors to intercept at the final approach fix, come down, circle, land, and in 2/10 you can have a flying time, you can have an IPC. I will say that this is, there's some conversation going on right now about this and ACS and how this all plays a role, and hopefully we can make this a little more straightforward, because again, I think there's if we could do an IPC, a full IPC in the sim, and the instructors had some, even if it was some pre-templated options for them on how to do this, we could really make that a much more effective training event than what it is right now. Because what it ends up right now is it's replication of primary instrument training, which
Right.
again is not the real world. And so we end up teaching for a test we don't have to take anymore. So, all right. And then last slide, I just put this up there because this really is, if you want to have some basic rules that, you know, have a goal, use realistic weather, keep it as realistic as possible, and don't try to kill yourself on every flight, right? Don't fail the engine at 2,000 feet in IMC, and then when you get down to land and you made a perfect no engine approach to a runway, it turns out the brakes are failed and you end up in the ditch. Like, that's okay. Bad day.
Perfect. I like it.
All right, and
All right.
it is perfect. I'm done with the formal.
All right. We are
Part.
going to stick around for Q&A. Josh has been kind enough to do that. So let's just, and of course we had this slide here. There we go. All right. So Dan, did you want to talk really quick about AOPA membership, and then we'll go to the official end here in just a moment.
Absolutely. And coincidentally, Josh and I had a great conversation about this at Redbird Migration. We were just chatting about AOPA and all of the benefits. Advocacy, of course, at the national level, at the regional level with our regional managers. We've got an office in DC for the federal level, but also the airport support network at just about every airport nationwide. We've got boots on the ground volunteer there to help keep their finger on the pulse of what's happening there. All of this is provided from members, you know, so from the membership there. So you can be a part of the largest aviation community, but also do your part to help us help you. So help us help you, help us help you, being a member of AOPA. Stay informed, of course, and there is a wealth of tools, aviation tools and resources and more available through your AOPA membership, as well as saving some money with some great partners and programs that are exclusive to AOPA members. So
right.
With that,
I'll
go ahead,
throw
Josh.
in my testimonial
Yeah,
quick.
Please do.
About the value of an AOPA membership. I know it's an add-on, but my third call standing in that field in Mississippi was to the pilot protection program, because I didn't know if I had to fill out NTSB Form 830 and if they were going to take my airplane and do inspections on it and all that stuff. And I don't, because you only have to fill out a form if something is damaged or an engine fails on an airplane with more than one engine.
Right. Oddly enough, weird reg, but yeah.
Yeah, super valuable for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh.
Cool, Josh. Yeah, that was Pilot Protection Services. So if you are an AOPA member, you can check that out. Let's go ahead. We're going to do the official end here for the folks that are trying to get their wings credit. You are good to go. We are going to stick around and answer questions, but make sure you tune in next time on April 18th, 2024. We gave up on the UTC because we kept screwing it up. So we're just going to say 12 to 1 Eastern time. And notice we didn't even bother with standard or daylight. But the topic's going to be VFR charts, IFR magic. This is a presentation that I've done some time ago in person, but it's how to use IFR plates. I'm going to teach you how to use IFR plates to make your night flying safer. So if you're ever going to an airport and you're wondering about the obstacles, I will help you interpret those and help you understand those, how you could use the IFR plates to make sure you don't hit anything as you come in, which is always a bonus. It's a good thing to have. If you have any idea for future topics, please let us know. There's the email, ftinitiative@aopa.org, or you can also throw it in the chat. I saw a bunch of questions about handouts, and I know Stephen has been putting some of the answers in, but for the handouts, folks looking for that handout, I'll just read his answers. It says, in your interface on the right side control bar, there should be a small square. It looks like a little piece of paper. And then what you want to do is click on that, and that should take you to the handout. I know in mine, it literally just says handouts, but yours may not look like that. So you're looking for the little thing that looks like a piece of paper. And if you are watching this on YouTube later, you should be able to go to the YouTube link. Stephen will always stick the handouts in the description of the YouTube video. All right, Dan, I think I hit everything. It is time for questions. Josh, are you ready?
Yeah.
So much out there. I did my best not to interrupt because you had great content there, Josh. Thanks so much for doing this. A lot of questions were rooted in customization for seminars. So maybe you can speak to that for Redbird products as can we can we get down to specific aircraft? And then also avionics was a big question. What can we do so I'm actually getting simulated work with as close to realistic as I possibly have? So you talk on that for a moment.
Yeah, so there's kind of, avionics are the biggest problem, period, for sims of any type, from the iPad to the level D, because they develop on their own cycle that is not, so it's got to come out, get installed in some airplanes, and then it'll make its way into the simulators. So there's always a lag there. And, you know, especially in the GA fleet, you know, they get put in different places, and that matters for training, and it's hard to do. And when you get into certified or approved devices, the avionics become super challenging because you also have to get that configuration approved, like where it is on the panel. And so, you know, we are working on the touchscreen, Garmin touchscreens right now, because there's a ton of them out there, and it needs to be part of it. And those will come out and be an upgrade path for people. But as far as like customization, that's where it gets really limited. Like we're going to do 750, 650 top and bottom, but the people that have two 650s, you know, that's not a thing we're going to end up doing. Or a person who has a 530 and then a 650 underneath it, or you know, a 650 and the Garmin radio underneath it, like that's just not, you know, we can't emulate that on, especially on the approved devices with a ton of flexibility. I'll also throw in another, especially for at-home sims, if you really want to do this and get as close to your panel as possible, and you're not concerned about the approval, which honestly, that's a great option, because like you can book a time at a flight school and get the requirements for instrument currency, or you know, knocked out. But for real practice doing it at home, real sim gear makes really nice hardware that goes on unapproved devices that you can build at home, and you can get closer to your panel that way. It's not going to end up being cheap, but that's a pretty good way to do it.
Yep, very cool. So many pilots use an iPad with an EFB. Is there a way to integrate using an iPad for Flight Garmin Pilot or other EFBs and sims?
And that's I should make a slide about that. That's super valuable and super important, because you're totally right. Tons of the flight planning happens on that iPad. In a Redbird product, we make Redbird Sims. We do make a product that connects through the ADSB interface that Sentry uses, that connects into ForeFlight. So you get location data, but you also get the AHARs and all that kind of stuff. If you have an at-home desktop sim that's running Microsoft Flight Sim and X-Plane, I think there is on the in their user guides and help forms, I don't know the specific address, but there's a way to natively, I guess, connect it to those pieces of software. So for 90% of people, you should be able to find a pretty straightforward way to get at least location data, so the ownership is right in ForeFlight or Garmin. Garmin's a little more difficult because they don't use the same communication protocol that ForeFlight uses, and so it's harder to get ownership onto Garmin across the board. But ForeFlight is pretty straightforward.
Very cool. This was my favorite question of the whole lot. So Josh, how much do you feel turning in a simulator helped you successfully land in your engine out event?
Yeah. So a bunch, mostly because it helped. I've been, obviously I'm super lucky. I have access to a sim very easily, and I also have access to really good instructors, and have flown with sort of very much that sort of mentor instructor pilot model, where it's not just primary training. And so I've been in situations in sims that were actually scary, you know, like I had suspended disbelief enough that it was like, wow, it feels like life and death. And so I had the opportunity to have that experience. And I'll say, for me, in a real emergency, the thing that stuck out the most was my mental response, like what was happening in my head, you know. I know my procedures really well. I practice those all the time in the sim, and the sim certainly helped. But truth be told, procedural, like where do I put my hands, you can do that with sticky notes. You know, you don't actually need a full-fledged simulator. Full-fledged simulators, a good advantage, but to me, the best part of it was having the experience of being scared in a simulator, and not. I think it definitely helped me not panic in the airplane.
Good feedback. How realistic would an inadvertent spin be in a sim? Is a spin training and awareness a good thing to work on?
Yeah, so sims generally spin very poorly in terms of the actual physics of it, right? The entry to the spin is usually emulated pretty well. It's pretty good. And then the exit from the spin, the procedural stuff you have to do, release the back pressure, opposite rudder, power out, all that works fine, and the airplane will pop out of a spin. And then the resulting dive is also simulated really well. And I'll say I've done a ton of spins. My dad owns a T6 Texan, and I got a bunch of flying in that. And I did some aerobatic instruction for a while. And it's there are pilots that really they got the spin exit really down because they've thought about it and practiced it, and their power and release the G's and put the rudder in, and they pop out, and you end up in this screaming dive, and they're like, "Oh, I'm out of the spin. It's great." We're like 5 knots from red line here, and so all that stuff is good in the sim. The inadvertent sim part of it would be, or the inadvertent spin part of it would be difficult to do to really catch you off guard. Like you would need an instructor that knew exactly what to do to set you up into that position where you would get into it. But I think it's not going to simulate the actual what it looks like at the cockpit, what it feels like, what the airplane does in the spin. But procedurally, getting into it, getting out of it, all that's pretty accurate. But inadvertent is going to be a tough thing to spring on yourself.
Yeah. There's a good bit of comments on Mike Fright, ATC add-ons. You talked about that, AI-based ATC add-ons, things like that. Any that you've had more experience, less experience, could recommend, or for maybe give people a few ideas on what to look for in products like that?
So like I said, Pilot Edge is my preference there. I know VATSIM is available, and the issue with VATSIM, I think personally, is if you're using it to prepare yourself to go talk to real ATC, sometimes you get lucky with VATSIM and you get a controller that sounds like and knows what they're doing. Other times, you don't, because they have an online course that you take, and then you can be a VATSIM controller. Pilot Edge is using real controllers who gone through the actual FAA training and have stood in a tower or been on a center, and know what they're doing. So Pilot Edge is 100% my preference there. I'll say Pilot Edge is honestly more about mic fright for me. I think it's good for teaching that, and it's good for teaching you're doing something that's consuming memory space, and then you have to respond to an ATC instruction. It's good for that too. But if you just want to learn the language and how to talk and what the format in which you say, there is a service, plain English maybe.
Plain English.
Yeah.
Plain English.
That is pretty good at just teaching it, and it's voice-based recognition, and it'll help you just sort of go through, what does this clearance sound like? How do I respond? All that kind of stuff, and it's good for just teaching the basics of it. And so again, those are tools. You use them in different parts of your journey as a pilot, and there's probably some other stuff that's going to come down the road around this, because it is definitely an issue.
That's PLANE English, so plane as an airplane, yeah.
Yep, good. Which model or models of Redbird AATDs are used at the EAA Proficiency Center?
Those are LDs.
LDs. Awesome. Some stuff on procedures. So yeah, practicing engine failure on takeoff sure seems like a great procedure to practice.
Yeah.
Without a doubt there. And
at least in our sims, it's the only one I've done that in. They do a really good job of, if you're in the rotation pitch attitude and you fail the engine at 100 feet or 50 feet, something like that, you will stall and fall out of the sky very quickly. And so it teaches you to come forward on the yoke immediately. Which is very counterintuitive. So that's a good one for sure.
Interesting.
That falls in the practice what is dangerous category.
There you go. You mentioned sitting on the couch doing airport entry procedures, things like that on an iPad. What would you use iPad wise? Any programs that you are familiar with, could use, or would recommend?
My personal favorite is Infinite Flight. In fact, that I don't know of any other that does a really good job. I guess X-Plane has this iPad-based sim. I really just like Infinite Flight. I think it's good interface and it does a good job. And you can fly it with the iPad. The throttle is a little use your finger thing, but there is something a little nice about being able to turn the airplane like that with the iPad. And again, you lose your physical skills slower than you lose your knowledge. So keeping that in mind, the things you want to do on the iPad are really the knowledge-based stuff and the thinking through kind of issues.
And one thing I've used Infinite Flight too, and the one thing I liked about it as well is do you have that option for, it's like the HUD view or something, but it looks a lot like now the G500s and the glass cockpit type stuff. It's similar with the speed tape and all that other stuff to get used to it. So
yeah, you can practice your scan.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one for both of my CFI instructor plans here, our friends here. So does flying approaches for currency in an AATD or basic training simulator require the presence of an instructor so that they can be logged to meet the 6 approaches in one hold in 6 months' time?
Excellent question. As of 2018 or 19, no, it does not. Prior to that, it did, but now it is. They have moved it to the same legal requirements as flying it in the airplane. So you do need to be in simulated. You need to be in instrument conditions in the sim. So make sure you set the weather down. But you can log it just like you could log it if you were flying by yourself in IMC in the airplane.
And you don't have to wear a hood anymore either. So like the old reg used to require, which was
yes, you could
silly,
make 0-0 visually, but you still have to put a hood
on. Question from a flying club representative, 170 members in their club. They have a desktop sim with yoke and rudder pedals. Could you make a quick list of like 5 or so exercises for proficiency that would be fun to get members more involved or encouraged to use the sim that they've got for their club?
Yeah, so if you're doing, I assume VFR kind of stuff.
I think so.
Yeah, so I would say, short field landings and takeoffs are fun, and you can make them a competition. You can, depending on the software, there are ways to track, you see how long your landing roll was. So those are, I think those are like socially fun. If it's running a Microsoft-based sim engine, if you go to San Diego, there's an aircraft carrier in the harbor there, and you can land and take off from said aircraft carrier. And you don't even need to track anything because it's very hard to land on it. And so that's an easy one from an engagement perspective. And then I would do probably do some local procedure stuff. So if there's most sim engines have the visuals have the main thing, like sort of the bigger features around. So bigger roads, rivers, even some of the more noticeable buildings are in the visuals. And so if you're landing on, let's say it's runway 35, and you know that I need to turn base before I get to this road or whatever, local procedure kind of stuff there are, or if you're entering the traffic pattern from the south, fly over this rock quarry, that kind of stuff I think is really good to do in the sim, and it's a good use of time, so you're not having to do an area familiarization flight out in the real thing. You can do that in the sim. You can take them out to, this is our designated practice area or whatever. And then if the flying club does any organized flyouts, like if you guys decide you're going to go to, some airport 30 miles or 50 miles away for breakfast or lunch one day, making the sim available with that for that fly out, in the months leading up to it, so people can come in and it's set up for them and they can practice that flight, back and forth, because there's lots of pilots that's really their mission, right? Is those sort of once a month, once every quarter, kind of fly someplace and get a meal and come back. And so you're practicing the mission. You should do that,
And I wanted to 2 things here. One thing I know as you were talking, and I didn't want to interrupt before, but for VFR cross countries, I know when I was a student pilot, and I've mentioned this on the show before, but as a student pilot, even later, flying VFR cross countries for that exact same thing, because when I would go and actually do the flight for real, I was like, oh yeah, there's that lake and there's all the stuff that I had seen on the chart. I already had an idea of what it looked like, what the airport was oriented. So it was really helpful for that. And then we did have a request here from Santosh, who's saying, and I believe this is still true because I remember seeing that he says, it would really be nice. This is a request for development for you potentially. I guess maybe it's for ForeFlight, never mind. But it's like weather on the EFBs. So that when the EFBs, it's like when you put the sim weather in, it doesn't show up in the EFB. It always shows the real world weather. So is there a way to eventually? It sounds like you're already on this.
This is recorded, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so I'm going to clip that section. I'm going to send it to some folks I know. Yes, we'd love that. That'd be great. Let's do that. Agreed.
So it sounds like it's a question more to go to the request to go to the software developers for like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot and all those, the EFB makers.
Yeah. But they get real nervous about spoofing and stuff like that. So I mean, they have valid reasons to not do that because they don't want to create some protocol where you could be connected to a random network in an FBO and somebody can spoof weather or push weird stuff in there.
Good point.
And so on the VFR thing, the VFR cross country thing, 2 points there. This is where that real world weather thing matters a ton, because when you go fly that VFR cross country in the real world, you will not have 100 miles of visibility at 10,000 or 7,000 feet. And so setting that back to something realistic, so you know, okay, when I'm over this road and I have 30 miles of visibility, I should be able to see the tip of that lake. That'll help a lot. And then most sims allow you to speed up time. So if it's like a 2-hour flight, don't get overwhelmed and say, I gotta fly, it's gonna take me 2 hours to do the same. No, you can do the takeoff, speed it up, and then when you get close to your checkpoints, slow it down so you get a real-time experience of what it looks like coming over.
Hey, a couple quick things that just popped up. One person, James, is saying Microsoft 2020, Flight Sim 2020 uses real world weather, so as EFB matches. Of course, the problem there is if you want to set up something that's not real world, it doesn't work. But then Peter is saying just make an ADSB out in your sim so it looks like a real airplane to the EFB. I'm not sure how difficult that is, but
so that is how Redbird connects to ForeFlight essentially. But it's not an actual like ADSB broadcast, but we use that same ADSB protocol to communicate with ForeFlight. So it gets you heading and airspeed and all that kind of stuff, as well as position. And that protocol has the capability, obviously, to get weather from Sentry. But we need to do it in a way that's doesn't break stuff.
Right. Cool. Shifting gears a bit, what kind of maintenance, routine maintenance, is required on a BATD setup?
So if it's an approved device, BATD of any kind, it's not really a maintenance thing, it's more of a regulatory thing, but the letter expires every 5 years from the date it was issued, so make sure you keep track of that date. The manufacturer of the device is responsible for getting it renewed or approved. So if they're still in business, contact them to get a new letter. If they're not in business, it's a bad day, but you have a QAG and anyone can submit a device for approval. I'll just say that right now. And then from a maintenance side, there's very little that's actually required maintenance to maintain approval. There are some internal checks that happen before a flight launches. Then the connection speeds have got to be less than 100 milliseconds, which is all computers, so that's a very, very low bar. Depending on the mechanical setup of the sim, you have bearing, you have frictions and all that kind of stuff, and those could be oiled, but there's not really a whole lot. I mean, unlike the airplane, the sim is not exposed to large forces and exterior weather and all that kind of stuff, so the maintenance is not a lot. I will say though, for like a bigger sim or a sim that you're working with in an instructor, and you could do this at home, I have a pre-flight checklist. It is not actually important, right? It's not checking that the sim is going to break or is unsafe. It's for realism, because you don't get in an airplane before you do some checks, right? And so I have made a pre-flight check where they go and on one of our sims on an FMX where they touch the band, move it around, and make sure that things are secure on the side. And it's 100% for training value, not for maintenance.
Makes sense. We talked a lot about training for the pilot, but could a sim be beneficial for CFI training?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think the sim would be great for CFI training. And like the actual teaching maneuvers or teaching procedures in a sim, I think would be really useful. Primarily because the main way you teach is with your voice, with speech, right? And you can do that sitting next to each other, and maybe you fly with a pilot that's learning. The pilot can't log the time, but you get the opportunity to see what it looks like for somebody to actually struggle with something. And then probably more beneficial would be, or you would also include flying with a more advanced instructor, more experienced instructor playing the role of a pilot. And then there's a lot of nuance in how far do you let somebody go before you intervene. And that's probably a good thing to do. Again, practice what's dangerous. It's 50 feet off the ground. What's the tolerable band of deviation from airspeed and altitude and heading for a landing?
Cool.
Yep.
We had a note from Douglas saying a pilot proficiency plan development lesson would be great. Something like a checklist or a list of things to consider, which actually sounds a whole lot like your app, doesn't it, Josh?
And I do have, actually, it'll be on our website hopefully in the next month, but I do have a paper form thing because this has become a personal project of mine to kind of give people tools to do this, because I think it's important for us as an industry. So it should be on the Redbird website soon, hopefully. It's very much like a checklist and
And I want to throw out there too.
There are some great tools. Cirrus actually has some awesome ones for creating personal minimums, and they give you this like green, red, blue rating. And Chris is laughing, so probably AOPA has something that I've ignored totally. But personal minimums, there are quite a good set of tools out there, but not a lot for proficiency plan creation.
And I was just going to add in, just going back, and I got people, I'm looking at some of the stuff that people are popping in here. What were we talking about before? The proficiency, well, we have the proficient or the focus flight review, which is in there. And then what was the part you were just talking about, Josh? Because I'm like looking at questions, my mind is personally. Oh yeah, we have the ASI's got the personal minimums contract for both VFR and IFR you can work through. So really, really good. By the way, Air Manager, Douglas wanted to mention, it's a great software for creating custom instrument panels. I have heard of that one too, so another good one. And then what is the other one?
If you get a touch screen monitor, and you use the Air Manager to make a panel, and you get avionics that'll work in it. You can do just touch the screen to run your GPS or whatever, and I think that's really useful.
Yeah, good idea. And I think that was the biggest one. One of the reasons I was smiling too is somebody said, "What are your views on wing overs and aileron rolls in the sim?" I guess it depends on the airplane. Microsoft Flight Sim worked pretty well with that.
But again, I'll throw it in there. Don't let it turn into a video game.
Right.
We had Josh, someone wrote in, they actually own a Redbird TD2 and could use some help getting it set up.
Okay.
Who should they reach out to?
Support at redbirdflight.com, or if they don't if they're in desperate need and want help right away, they can email me, and I will first initial last name at redbirdflight.com.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, we have a few more questions, but we have certainly gotten to the end of our time. But great content. Chris, handing it back over to you to take us home.
All right. Well, number one, we obviously want to thank Josh Harnagel, because in case they forgot your name, Josh Harnagel for being on from Redbird. We really appreciate you being here, Josh. Did a great presentation. I think people really enjoyed it. Tons of comments here. So thank you for giving us your time and your expertise on this. Yeah. It was mostly good. Yeah, we'll talk about it. We're teasing. No, it was all really good. Don't forget our next episode, April 18th, 2024. So that's just next month. VFR charts, IFR magic. I know somebody already said that they tried this out once some years ago and it worked really well. So we already have somebody vouching for the idea that I'm going to be talking about. So hope you join us there. Hope you join us there. And the email is ftinitiative@aopa.org. And I think that is it. So Dan, Stephen, and I know we had another Chris on the backside. Would appreciate all you guys being here. Thank you again, Josh, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
See you.